Hello, everyone. We are another group of students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and we worked on people who are moving into Venice. So we found the motivations to move to Venice for expatriates, remote workers, returnees, and retirees. I'm Olivia, and I worked with Nithya, Joey, and John on this project.
Okay, so Venice is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, so much so that UNESCO has actually added it to its list of World Heritage Sites. Additionally, the city also has a long history and a rich culture, as the beautiful architecture of San Marco and the unique glasswork of Murano have attracted millions of people to the city. Unfortunately, though, Venice has been facing a steady depopulation since the end of World War II, and in 2023, it has only about a quarter of the population that it did in 1945. Luckily, however, there are plenty of groups of people moving into the city. The 5 largest of these groups are Chinese, Ukrainian, Romanian, Filipino, and French. This data shows us that Venice can attract people from all over the world, and our project hopes to strengthen this ability.
So the goal for our project is to understand the factors that allow people to settle in Venice by exploring the experiences of expatriates, remote workers, returnees, and retirees. Now, what are those groups of people? Expatriates, or expats for short, are individuals that are not originally from Venice, but have decided to move into the city for long-term settlement. These individuals can be from other places in Europe, other places in Italy, anywhere in the world, but the main important thing is that they were not originally from Venice and then decided to move into the city for long-term settlement. Remote workers are individuals with a job that allows them to work remotely, so it doesn't really matter where they live. They can live wherever they want in order to complete their work, but they decided to come to Venice to complete their remote work. Returnees are individuals that were born in Venice and then left for a period of time to settle abroad, and then decided to come back into Venice and settle abroad and settle permanently again. So the important thing with them is that they were born in Venice, born and raised, decided to leave Venice for a set amount of time, and then decided to come back and settle permanently. And finally, retirees can be any one of the groups mentioned before, but they are no longer working, i.e. they are retired and decided to live in Venice for the rest of their retirement. So in order to complete our project, our objectives were to explore the factors that attract people to settle into the historic city of Venice. We wanted to investigate the factors that influence people to stay in Venice, and we wanted to identify challenges that people face while living in Venice that might drive them out of the city later. So we wanted to explore what brings people into the city, what requires them to stay, what allows them to stay, and then what might drive them away in the future. To do that, we conducted various semi-structured interviews with Venetian residents. We talked about topics regarding life in Venice, relationship status, work, culture, and any challenges that they faced while living in Venice. Now, this project is a continuation from another team that took place over the summer of 2023, and they provided us with a few very important assets that allowed us to complete our project. First off, they gave us some contact information for Venetian residents that might be interested in an interview, so we were able to reach out using their contact information. They also gave us a suggested questionnaire of topics that they think we should talk about. We did take this questionnaire and we did expand it and we transformed it into something that we think we will use and topics that we wanted to cover that might be important. And they also gave us some preliminary research data of interviews that they were able to complete so that we can add our data to. So all data that we talked about tonight is a combination between the data that was gathered in the summer of 2023 and then our data that we gathered over the past 2 months. With all that being said, here is our results.
So as Joey said, we are working with the interviews that they conducted over the summer, which was 38 interviews. And over the past 2 months, we've been able to complete 62 interviews. So all of our data that we're looking at is about 100 total interviewees. We tried to get an even split of gender identity, and we were able to do so. We got about 43 male and 57% female. This is good, so we get both perspectives on the issues. And as you can see, we mainly interviewed expatriates. This is for 2 reasons. One, expatriates were easier to find. Remote workers can kind of work anywhere, so they were difficult to find. And also returnees. Turns out a lot of people do not come back to the city. And secondly, the summer team primarily focused on expatriates, so their research really only talked about them. And just to jump into our interviewees' jobs, 21% of our interviewees were teachers, and this includes like secondary school or professors at the universities here. The second largest group was service workers, and it's also important to note that we did go out to some of the shops around Venice and tried to interview the shop owners, and a lot of them lived in Mestre, and so we weren't able to include them in our data. This will be mentioned later with some of the housing and expenses issues. But service is a big thing here because of all of the tourism. And our third biggest group was art, which makes sense because Venice is a beautiful place full of wonderful culture and art. And as far as jobs for remote workers go, 29% of them were in business. We interviewed some business owners, so they were able to work anywhere they wanted because they were their own boss. The second biggest was art. Again, Venice is a wonderful hub for art. And the third biggest was technology. Obviously, if you work in technology, you can work anywhere you want. And as far as where our interviewees were from, as we know, 12% of them were returnees, so they're originally from Venice, so they are Italian. And then that other 35% are people outside of Venice that we considered expats. As Joey said, anyone from Italy who's not originally from Venice would be considered an expatriate. And our other big groups were people from the United States of America, England, and France. And we also tried to get an even distribution of age to get multiple different opinions. And as you can see, people mostly move into Venice when they're about 20 or 30. And unfortunately, Venice is aging. Most of our interviewees were 60 plus. So that's part of the issue with the depopulation, is that people are getting older and we need more people, new people to come in at a younger age to fill that gap.
After analyzing the data gathered from our interviews, we identified 4 main factors that attracted people to move into the historic city of Venice. The first one, the primary factor bringing people to Venice, was work. Individuals relocated after finding an in-person permanent job position. In addition to in-person jobs, remote work opportunities also served as an attractive factor. A notable example was an interviewee from Paris who successfully transitioned into a digital nomad lifestyle through a specialized program, marking a significant turning point in her life. The second factor was the pursuit of higher education. Several individuals highlighted the esteemed universities in Venice, particularly noting their excellence in fields such as economics and architecture. The third factor was relationships. Individuals, particularly returnees, decided to come back in order to rejoin their families, while others came back for love, opting to be closer to their significant others based in Venice rather than maintaining a long-distance relationship. The final factor was choice. Venice is beautiful and it offers a very unique lifestyle, attracting several individuals to come in and experience it. We observed that among those who came in by choice, they had a deep sentimental connection with the city, rooted in either a previous visit that led to a profound love for Venice or familial ties, such as one interviewee who had a connection with Venice because of his mom who grew up in Croatia, which is close to Venice, and he described the city being at the center of his heart.
So through our interviews and the coding of the transcripts that resulted, we were able to identify the main factors as to why people chose to stay permanently in Venice. So the most important of these factors was lifestyle. And the interviews cited walkability and the not having to worry about the cost of owning a car as major factors that they appreciated. And one of our interviewees also said that she appreciates that since there are no cars, she doesn't have to worry about getting into an accident or getting hit. The second most important one was friends and family. So we were often told that having a relative who had lived here prior to them coming, or their spouse who they met when they first arrived, played a significant role in making them want to stay permanently in the city. Additionally, parents said that they appreciate being able to let their kids walk to school on their own because they trust that Venice is a safe and tight-knit community. And I think a quote that exemplifies how Venice is a tight-knit community is the following: "You have a kind of relation person to person which you don't have anywhere else." And then the next most important factor was work. So we found that although some people struggled with finding a job in Venice, we found that once they were able to secure a job, they were much more likely to stay. And here's a quote from an eye doctor, an ophthalmologist we interviewed, and she said, "I began to work in the hospital in Venice. It's wonderful. I think it's one of the most beautiful hospitals in the world." And then the final most important factor was culture and beauty. And this makes sense since UNESCO added it onto their list of World Heritage Sites. So it makes sense that people would want to stay for the culture and the beauty of Venice. And this quote says, "Everywhere in Venice is like an open museum. There's so much to discover."
And next, we're going to get into some of the challenges that people face. So unfortunately, the biggest problem that people cited was the mass tourism in Venice, specifically the fact that the Venice is governed by touristic demand and it's in competition with the needs of the residents. And part of this is tied into the politics. Some of our interviewees felt like the government should be doing more to help Venetian residents. That's not currently being done. So 61% of our interviewees say that tourism is an issue in the city. And it's not going to change if the politics don't change. The specific interviewee said many things have to change together or else we will be staying in a sinking city. And sinking city, obviously we all know there's problems with the water, but she also meant in an economic sense. And one of the questions that we specifically, just the fall team, did was asking if they felt any changes in the city. So this data is based just on our 62 interviews that we did this fall. The biggest category of changes is they see that there's more tourists. Obviously, we can see this in data and in numbers, but people also felt it like walking around the city. They said it was harder to walk around, that the tourists used to only come in the summer, and now they're here all year long. I'm going to skip down to the third one, less residents. Obviously, we've seen that with our graphs, but also people said they felt like their friends were moving away, their family was moving away because they weren't able to live in Venice anymore, which is sad. And then I'm going to jump back to the shops. 27% of our fall interviewees noticed a change in the shops. And this is a change from having butchers and hardware stores to more shops for tourists, things like the masks and Murano glass. And anyone who walks around Venice can see that there are so many of these shops. And specifically, one person we interviewed cited that she wasn't able to find something as simple as a button on the island. She had to go either to Mestre or order it online. And when you take these shops away from the residents, it makes it much, much harder to live here. Nextly, 11% noted that the housing issues have increased, as we learned from Casa Piota. Obviously, there are housing issues in Venice because of the Airbnbs and so many short-term rentals because of the tourists. But this person noted that finding a house is getting even harder, and the cost of buying one is getting very, very high. And lastly, 5% of our interviewees feel that Venice is becoming less safe. This is a small percent, but as we noted in our reasons people stay, safety is one of the reasons people enjoy Venice so much. People are able to send their fourth grader to just go walk to school and they don't have to take them. And because there's no cars, it's a very safe place to raise kids, which a lot of our interviewees are doing. And so this specific woman said the city was safer. She wasn't afraid to walk alone in the city after 3 p.m., and now she would be afraid to let her children outside past 11 p.m. And as I mentioned earlier, housing and the expenses of living in Venice was another big challenge that people faced. They say it's impossible to rent here. She's a 30-year-old woman just trying to do 30-year-old things, and she's unable to afford them, and it's just very, very difficult. Specifically, Italians think Venice is expensive. Again, I said 47 of our interviewees were Italian. And when they are comparing it to other places in Italy, it seems very expensive. One person specifically saying it's absolutely absurd, the amount of money for rent combined with groceries. And it's very expensive, especially when people are comparing it to the mainland. But when we look at foreigners' data, they don't tend to think it's as expensive. Specifically Europeans, the majority of them actually think it's not expensive. This makes a lot of sense because a lot of our Europeans were from either England or France. And when you look at cities like Paris and London compared to Venice, they are much more expensive. In fact, one of our interviewees used to live in Paris and moved to Venice because it was so much more affordable. And when you look at North America, which includes interviewees from the United States and Canada, they're a little more split, with 59% thinking it's expensive. And then also something to note is the teachers here think it's very expensive. We noticed reasons people stay and people come here is because of studying. And unfortunately, this person did not think that teachers in Italy are paid very well, and so it is very expensive to live here on her salary. But we do need teachers to help our universities and schools. And like I said, 21% of our interviewees were teachers, so it's a very popular job here. And 78% of those teachers thought that Venice was expensive.
Another one of the main challenges that interviews cited as a challenge living in Venice is a category that we are calling social barrier. Social barrier has to do with how an individual is able to acclimate to life in Venice, in the social scene, whether they feel accepted by other Venetian residents, whether they would consider themselves Venetian, and other things related to that. So of the people that we interviewed, 90% said that they felt accepted while living in Venice, which is an amazing thing. They cited that Venetians are super open, super welcome, super able, wanting to talk with them, and other things like that. This interviewer said that she absolutely feels accepted, which is a great thing to see. However, only half would consider themselves Venetian. This comes from an idea that we heard talked about a lot during our interviews, which is that Venetian culture, for people that are born in Venice, can oftentimes be very isolated and very protective. And this is because of the high amounts of tourism within the city, wanting to protect their city and wanting to protect their culture from high amounts of tourism and the degradation of their culture. This interviewer said that Venetians are really proud to be born here, and they have a different kind of relationship with the city, with the water, with how things move, and the way of life in Venice. On that note, many people have different definitions of what it means to be Venetian. One interviewer said that living, working, and loving the city, that is what makes someone Venetian. They don't have to be born here, but as long as they work, they love living here, they love the culture, they embrace themselves, then those are Venetians in her mind. There's another camp of people that say that there are few very real Venetians that are left in the city. Many people live here, but they're not from Venice. Being born in Venice and growing up in the culture gives you an appreciation for the location around you, an appreciation for the architecture, the buildings, the way of life. Those are Venetians in her mind. Another challenge that individuals cited is transportation and accessibility, or the idea of moving yourself and moving things around Venice, which oftentimes can be very difficult. As, of course, Venice is a very unique city within the world, Europe especially, most of the city being on water and having to do with a lot of walking, moving large items such as furniture, or if you're doing renovations in your house, can be particularly difficult, having to move large-scale things through narrow alleyways or on and off boats, things like that. And individuals that have any sort of accessibility need or any mobility aids cite that it is very difficult, almost impossible to move around. One of the people that we interviewed cited that when she broke her ankle, it was almost impossible for her to move around the city. One of the final challenges that individuals cited facing was finding a job, as we mentioned before. If this interviewer found a proper job related to their studies, of course they were willing to stay. But if they couldn't, they would absolutely need to move. This comes back to a topic that we said earlier, with a lot of the job market being dedicated solely to tourism. If you are an individual that does not want to work in that type of field, it can be very hard to find a sustainable and well-paying job for you here. And if you cannot find a sustainable and well-paying job, then you will have to leave and go other places to find that. In fact, 47% of the 20-year-olds that we interviewed do not know if they plan on staying, which is very important for us because, as we said before, the 20 and 30-year-old mark was a lot of the groups of people that were coming in and moving into Venice. These individuals cite few job opportunities outside of tourism, dwindling resources for residents, and they wanted to discover other places where they can hopefully be as successful.
Despite these challenges, 73% of our interviewees stated that they plan on staying in Venice. One of our interviewees perfectly captured this sentiment by saying, "One has to make some compromises, but living in Venice is rewarding." This perspective suggests the positive and resilient outlook on those who have chosen Venice as their residence, acknowledging the difficulties, but having a deeper sense of fulfillment that outweighs the challenges. Going back to the graph on our initial slide, how can we create this rebound? How can we reverse the trend and repopulate the city? To facilitate the process, there are two main components: to retain current residents and to attract more expats, returnees, and remote workers. Our project findings highlighted that work was the primary motivator for people to move into Venice. Therefore, the most effective solution would be to improve the city's work infrastructure. This would involve encouraging the development of more startups. Our partnering organization, Serendipity, is committed to producing high-quality jobs in the historic city by promoting startups and providing entrepreneurial support. Other methods to further improve the city's work infrastructure are to expand the diversity of non-extractive jobs, provide more remote work opportunities, develop co-working spaces, and to promote initiatives that support creative communities. These solutions are consistent with the framework and conclusions of Smart Desk, an EU-funded research project whose mission is to help combat issues that arise with tourism-related mobilities as part of their Venice case study. We hope that in the future, after the implementation of these initiatives and solutions, we can change the saying that Venice is beautiful, but I'd never lived there, to Venice is beautiful, and I live here. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Questions or comments? There are several of you who were interviewed as part of this project. Any comments from you guys?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My one question is, have you had any interaction or talk with institutions, with the comune, with local governments, local politicians about these topics? And what do you generally feel is their attitude in relation to this kind of issue?
So we haven't been in contact with them. That was going to be one of our recommendations at the end of our paper. It does seem from how our interviewees felt that the government does not react well, but we haven't personally reached out to them yet. But we do recommend that groups in the future reach out.
Just 1 second, just to clarify, this is the tail end of a long-term project that went on for 3 years, the Smart Desk project. It was a EU Horizon project, where we did interact with the local authorities because we can speak Italian. These guys unfortunately don't speak Italian, so that was a little more complicated.
This was very beautiful, and I liked it a lot, and I appreciate it a lot. I think it's nice and professional. I have only one remark. One thing I think you missed in the end, among the things that needs to be done to keep the people staying in Venice. The most important comment that you had before about the challenges of being in Venice was that rents are too high and that life is expensive. Now, I think this should have been also your first point in what to do to attract the people to live in Venice. And the first thing is to abolish tourist locations. I'm sure somebody must have mentioned this, because tourist locations are the ones that make it impossible for Venetians to stay or to come to live here. So tourist locations and the cost of living, those are, I think, perhaps it should have been emphasized a little more.
You missed the previous presentation because you came in only at right now. The previous presentation was all about housing and tourist locations. So it will be on the video. We're recording everything, so you can watch it on our YouTube channel after the fact. Umberto?
The short question, it's on about the methodology you adopted to analyze the interviews. Did you keep them separated? Did you transcribe them? Did you use any tool to analyze the content of the interviews you conducted?
Do you want to talk about it?
So for whenever we did our interviews, we made sure to record the audio of them so that we also had one of us would be taking notes while the other was asking questions. So we always had one person taking notes, and then we recorded the audio. With that audio, we ran it through a speech-to-text generative AI in order to gather a workable text file for any comments that we may have missed while writing it down. That transcription service was called Nota.ai, N-O-T-T-A.ai. We found it was very useful. It was a very useful tool for analyzing our data and our information and making sure that if we missed anything, we can always go back, find a lot of the quotes that we mentioned here, word for word, exactly what they said, to really help us analyze our data.
The e-term or the summer group had a coding system that they used at the end of theirs. So we started with that and tried to build on their codes of like community lifestyle when we picked up on those things in interviews.
Just a brief question from retired people, retired men. Venetian repatriate after 40 years more or less abroad. We are all bound to die, we old ones, so there is no much use in interviewing us. But the main issue is, what do you think, you personally, of living in Venice, staying in Venice? Which kind of work, which kind of activity you would plan, and would you like to stay here? Because the young ones are the ones who make the story.
Okay.
I have to say, Tonino is a returnee. He lived in South America for many years, going back and forth, Europe, so he's one of those. Next time we'll interview him. Go ahead and answer, go ahead.
Personally, I think Venice is a beautiful place and I would love to stay here. Unfortunately, we did interview like a couple engineers and they had to look outside of Venice for work. And because we are all getting engineering degrees, the main thing we found was that it was hard to find a job here. So that would be my main concern. But if I were able to find a job here, I think this is a beautiful place that I will definitely keep in mind for the future.
He's an engineer. I'm an engineer. Maybe you should get my job.